Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Really pleased to have so many of you here today on this really lovely fall morning. I know I was talking to one of our panelists who came here, walked over here from their office, so really hopefully folks get out and enjoy the beautiful weather we have here today in Washington. This is a topic we've come at about once a year. We tend to have a conversation where we bring together the intersection of tax and trade, and I was joking with Kathy Schultz, who's been one of the people who've been gracious enough to join us at WITA in the past, that we often find that these worlds don't always intersect, the tax and trade world in the minds of people in Washington, the different agencies that work on it. Even though it's the same committees on the Hill, it's often different staff that people are working with within companies. It's often different people within governments, it's different people. So, but we, a number of us, and I think all of you here in the audience recognize this intersection. We're really glad to try to bring these streams together. Of course, where Kathy sits at the National Foreign Trade Council, it's built into their DNA, and it's something that we have increasingly been talking about at WITA, so we're really glad to have all of you here today for this very important discussion. Warren Payne also has spoken at WITA events in the past, and we're really happy to welcome a couple new people, Libby Coffin and Jennifer McCluskey, to our event today. We hope to see more of you, all of you, and your colleagues at some of our upcoming events in a couple of weeks. We have an event on the WTO and the issues that are going on with the dispute settlement body and the appellate body there. That'll be on Thursday the 21st. We'll be announcing the panelists for that either later today or tomorrow. That's on the 21st, and we want people to start planning and take out your personal organizers and your smartphones. February 4th is our Washington International Trade Conference. We've begun reaching out to potential speakers. We should be announcing some of those speakers probably in the next couple of weeks. People who will be speaking. It's an all-day conference looking at some of the hot issues in international trade and also trying to look forward to some of the new issues that will be coming up on the horizon. That's the theme this year, New Horizons in Trade. Tuesday, February 4th in this building, and we hope to have all of you there and your organizations involved if you want to be. You can contact me or Diego Inez, and we're happy to give you more information about that. That's on February 4th. With that, I'll turn it over to Kathy to take over and guide us through this very interesting and complicated world that's intersecting with our trade worlds and is so important for businesses around the world. So thank you for doing this, everybody.
Well, thank you, Ken. Fortunately, we are just past Halloween. So if we start to tell some scary stories, just remember that we're very close to the Halloween. This has nothing to do with black cats walking across football fields. It could be how you might feel if you were a Houston fan on the last day of the World Series. But we have a lot of interesting things going on right now, and I'd like to just give you a little background. I know everybody here understands what BEPS is. We've been through that in the past. Part of the BEPS project at the OECD started because countries were really concerned about digital companies particularly not paying what they consider their fair share of taxes. They sort of parked the issue in Action 1 and set it aside and determined that you can't ring-fence the digital economy. As they move forward, as part of Action 1, they set up something called the Task Force on the Digital Economy. The Task Force on the Digital Economy was supposed to start looking at how you're going to tax these issues and sort of how the OECD was going to continue to move forward on something that they weren't able to do as part of the entire multi-year BEPS project. While the OECD was starting to look at that, many other countries were saying, okay, we went through the BEPS project, we didn't get to tax the people we thought we wanted to tax. How are we going to start looking at this? The EU started to work on a digital service tax as part of the entire EU Commission. They were looking at it saying there's got to be a way forward. How do we figure out how to tax these companies? The way they were setting this up was to tax large digital companies, and they set thresholds that basically taxed American companies. There may be one or two other companies in the world, but otherwise they were setting it up to tax American companies. While they are looking at this, we have some other issues that are moving forward that cause a lot of problems because countries are not just looking to increase taxes on the digital companies and the digital platforms and however many other companies they can capture by this. But we also have a WTO moratorium on custom duties. And part of the custom duties and electronic transmission issue is that countries are now looking through the WCO and the WTO of a way to increase tariffs on pretty much the same kind of issues in the same companies. So we have the OECD starting to take a look at this early on. We have the EU moving forward on DSTs, and we have, potential tariffs and custom issues coming along. I'm not going to talk about the combination of that plus additional VAT taxes on these same issues right now, because that's a different subject that we'll get to another day. But as they started to move forward, the EU was unable to move forward as a group because you need unanimity to make tax changes in the EU. And so different countries decided that they would take it on their own. The French have passed the DST. Jen's going to go into a lot more details on the DSTs. And I'm sure you're aware that the US had started a 301 investigation as a follow-up to that. So we have the countries starting to look at how they're going to move forward with DSTs. We have the OECD had started their project. The OECD, after the DSTs started to come up, accelerated their project, and it morphed into a larger project that is considered, and Warren is going to go through more of the details of that project. But we have two pillars of work, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, most of them focused on what they call the digitalization of the economy, but has really moved to a change in sort of nexus rules and profit allocation. I'm not going to get into too many details on that. We'll let Warren give a big overview of that. But what we have is a world that is starting to come together, and it's one of the areas that both tax and trade really are tied, because now we have 301 investigations tied to digital service taxes. We have, other countries trying to find another way to deal with taxes. If they do it through tax, if they do it through tariffs, if they look at it, and trying to get the World Customs Organization involved. So we have several different ways that multiple countries are trying to get to the same sort of pool of money from the same group of companies. And I'm going to turn to Jennifer now and let her talk about more details on how some of these DSTs and the 301 investigations are going.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to WITA for organizing it. It's really important to elevate the relationship between tax and trade policy on digital taxes and various other initiatives that Kathy mentioned that are underway. The assertion that these issues are increasingly intermingled is unquestionable, as evidenced by the recent initiation of a 301 investigation by the US government against France due to their digital service tax. After offering a few comments on these DST taxes, I'm also going to offer a few observations from the ITI perspective on the commonalities with the WTO moratorium issue, and that can, as Kathy was mentioning, be projected as kind of a broad theme of what's going on around the world. As many of you may know, at ITI we represent 70 technology and technology-enabled companies. In my current role, I oversee both tax and trade policy, which has allowed me a really interesting vantage point to observe and work on these issues as they've unfolded in recent years. Taking a step back, when I started at ITI in 2015, they hired me to work on international tax issues exclusively in the US arena. Very quickly, by 2016, my work had expanded into Europe as it became clear the European Commission and a number of its member states were focused on taxing digital services. I think before I get into some of the interesting and salient points on those taxes, I'd offer a few observations on the environment in which these ideas first gained traction. I think that these observations are entirely relevant to the trade claims made about the DST, and it's very important to what's happening today at the OECD. The European Commission, as many of you may know, has long been interested in advancing Europe as a major technology hub. At the same time, a number of major European economies grew increasingly frustrated by perceived tax arbitrage. This frustration was in two directions. First, it was at economies that used tax incentives to onshore jobs and other economic activity. And it was also directed at companies they perceived to use this system to their benefit. Meanwhile, frustrations were growing that more tax was not being paid into market jurisdictions where products were interacting with the consumer, and this particularly applied to digital products. So tax became a big issue in Brussels alongside a sharp focus on the technology sector, which we've seen play out in various ways. From 2016 until 2018, with leadership from France, a serious effort was made to implement a digital service tax across Europe. From the beginning, this policy had concerning elements that seemingly became worse with time. First, and this is in the tax policy vein for the trade people in the room, DSTs are taxes on revenues, not profits, which is an interesting feature of this. It's even more interesting if you know tax policy because it appears that this was done in order to avoid conflicts with income tax treaties. Further, what this means in practice is that U.S. companies cannot credit these taxes paid against their U.S. tax obligations. This particular feature will lead to rampant cases of multiple taxation, which is a key outcome the international tax system seeks to avoid. There are two critical design features that cause concerns from the trade perspective, which Kathy just mentioned. First, there are the thresholds. Many of the DSTs, or actually all of them that we've seen around the world, have a threshold of 750 million euro. And then they have some local equivalent revenue figure that is smaller. In the context of some places, it's 3 million euro, and it goes up from there. In nearly every case we have seen, local companies fall short of these thresholds. Then there are scoping considerations. Most digital taxes are directed at advertising and platform services. The ways in which jurisdictions have crafted these provisions appear drafted to have also exempted any local players. While the EU initiative failed to gain the necessary unanimous support of member states needed for adoption, its key features lived on and are being pursued in France and numerous other jurisdictions. For the purposes of this conversation, it's important to note that the features that cause concern in the EU debate have caused us concern broadly and continue to do so. That is why ITI is firm in our assertion that the digital service taxes violate international tax norms, are unreasonable, discriminatory, and create trade barriers that may violate existing agreements between the United States and those contemplating such measures. An additional consideration is the theme of a rush to divergent unilateral action in the face of ongoing multilateral negotiations, which I will lead more into. We have been clear that there are issues that have arisen in the global economy due to digitalization, particularly in the tax space, but given the cross-border nature of commerce, those reforms need to be pursued in a multilateral fashion. Thankfully for all of us, 130 plus countries are conducting those negotiations as we speak at the OECD, and we support them. While I'm hopeful and optimistic about the OECD process, it will take time. And I think this is where I get into the critical part of the conversation for those in the room who follow trade. For this reason, we are in a critical period with implications that extend deeply into the trade realm. Some countries have shown determination to proceed with DSTs before the OECD finishes its work. The US government seems determined to avoid DSTs, particularly before the OECD process ends. Going back to the 301 investigation, it's important to note that it does remain underway despite the fact that they've put a hold on it until the end of this month in terms of issuing any kind of report. I would encourage folks to pay close attention to how the US government responds at the end of this month. The French measure is unique as it looks to be likely to be the first to be implemented. The US response to that tax will be an important signal to all countries contemplating such measures. Tariffs are not out of the question, and I would just say that to everyone in the room, and may be the best tool the government has to combat these measures. Without a tax solution at the OECD, widespread trade disputes are the most likely outcome. ITI hopes greatly to avoid such an outcome and are working hard to contribute to the OECD process, which is the best place to achieve a solution. So that's where I end my doom and gloom on the digital service taxes, but a couple of other quick observations from the tech industry perspective on the moratorium. The moratorium dynamics to date have more in common with the OECD process than they do with the digital service tax skirmishes. In both the OECD and the WTO context, developing countries want to ensure that they capitalize on the digitalization of the economy. In the OECD context, they want taxes paid to their market based on the economic activity generated. In the WTO context, developing countries have expressed more reliance on tariff revenues and they want to be able to apply tariffs on digital goods as revenue from non-digital goods declines. I would note again, while there are somewhat similar motivations, I must reinforce that they are very different processes and with different dynamics, and so the outcomes of one don't necessarily dictate the outcomes of another. In fact, I think at this point they're quite separate. That said, we are very much in favor of making the moratorium permanent. We believe that it has led to a lot of economic growth and prosperity for people all over the world from all different types of nations, and it's very important for us to maintain it moving forward. So with that very lengthy treatise on all of these matters, I will turn back to Kathy. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jen. And I'm going to turn to Warren to give us sort of a high-level overview. We're not going to get into the weeds on this because I think that particularly for folks who don't necessarily follow tax, getting into the deep weeds on the tax stuff is probably not beneficial. So Warren's going to give us an overview and explain sort of what's going on with the OECD process.
Thank you, Kathy. So again, my name is Warren Payne. I'm a partner in the tax and trade groups at Mayer Brown. And prior to that, I spent a number of years on the Ways and Means Committee staff in the House of Representatives where I handled both tax and trade matters for the committee. So Kathy and Jen have both kind of teased some of the key things here about the OECD negotiations. Before I dive in, I'm going to take a step back and do just a little tiny primer on what the current rules are, because I think having a basic understanding of those is important to understand just how significant the negotiations of the OECD are. So under kind of existing normal international trade or tax conventions, the rules are pretty straightforward about when you are liable for income tax in a foreign country. You have to have what's called a physical presence or permanent establishment. You have to be present in the market. What this means from a trade perspective is that if all you're doing is exporting into that market, whether you're exporting a good, a widget, or you're exporting a service via digital means or some other remote means, you wouldn't have that physical presence, you wouldn't have that permanent establishment, you would not be subject to income tax in that country in which you're exporting your good or service. What has happened as kind of the economy has become more digitalized and there's more sophistication, more technology, countries have become concerned about, well, hey, these companies are exporting into our market in a way that's new and different and broader and generating more revenue than it has been in the past. And that's been a key factor in why countries are looking at changing the way they do their tax systems. And as has already been noted, the initial focus has been on digital focused trade, hence DST. What this has meant, as has also been referenced, is the thresholds and the way these systems have been designed predominantly target American companies. So the U.S., in addition to responding with the 301, has sought to broaden the scope of the OECD negotiations and to move it away from something that is purely digital and instead getting at this concept of this kind of trade where you can be generating a lot of revenue from a foreign market without having its physical presence is often connected to economic activity where there's a lot of intangibles, where these intangibles create extra value, or what's called above normal return or above normal profit. And so we're going to take one more step further away, and we're going to say, okay, let's broaden this to all kinds of economic activity and trade that's heavy on intangibles. Well, how do you measure and define intangibles? Really hard. So instead of trying to define intangibles, we're going to use your level of profitability as a proxy for how much intangibles you're using in your trade and in the market activity you're engaging in that foreign country. So very quickly here, the OECD negotiations have moved away from something that is just digital specific to a much broader scope, capturing all kinds of sectors of the economy that might not be captured when we're talking about just digital. But I'll be honest, I think the reason for this and the rationale for this is fairly straightforward. The broader the scope of the negotiations, the more companies that are captured by the negotiations, and therefore the scope starts to move beyond just how much additional taxes American-based companies are going to pay, but it's also going to start capturing companies that are headquartered and located in other countries. And therefore, all of a sudden, all these other countries that are kind of driving this now have some defensive interests as well. It's not just an offensive interest for them. They go out and take revenue from American companies. Now some of their companies can be on the hook for additional revenue as well. The other thing to know about these negotiations is that they're supposed to be focused on what we call consumer-facing industries. Not well defined, not really sure what that is. The OECD paper says, well, component trade should be part of it. But ultimately, kind of the key factor here is things that are strictly business-to-business transactions are not supposed to be captured by this. So what does that mean? Not sure. Right? There are aspects of trade, and then by this probably the actual trading, transportation services, moving containers. That's strictly business to business. Is that going to be captured by this? Possibly not. But kind of that's a key scoping exercise, and it's relevant to the trade context. Is it going to be just a particular type of good or widget or service that's captured? Or is it going to be also the means by which trade happens? The other important thing to keep in mind here about how these negotiations are playing out, as Kathy mentioned, there's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is where most of the action is right now. That's about ensuring companies pay what's called the minimum tax or a minimum tax, their fair share tax. And if you do any tax work, kind of the analogous U.S. tax policy is the guilty provision of tax reform. The second, Pillar 2, which is a couple months kind of further behind in the process, is again more about that base erosion. And are individual companies engaging in kind of nefarious, in air quotes, nefarious tax planning to avoid tax in any given jurisdiction? Like here again, the kind of analogous U.S. tax provision is B. And so you've got these two negotiations taking place. They're really about who gets to tax the income. It is about moving away from the current rules, which say if all you're doing is exporting into that country, you're not subject to income tax. And it's about saying, well now, even if all you're doing is exporting into that country, we're now going to capture you in our income tax net. Important to know that these negotiations, whatever these new rules are, when all is said and done and these new rules are agreed to, these new rules will sit on top of the existing rules. They're not repealing or pulling out the current rules. And so this gets to a comment Jen made about the risk of double taxation. You're going to have a situation where, under the current rules, I'm exporting this product or this service to this foreign market, and my host country gets to tax that income because I'm resident, I'm in that country. Under these new rules, the export market now is going to get some right to tax that income as well. And now we have to figure out, well, wait, how do I reconcile these two amounts? I think there's a very, very real risk, and Jen mentioned this, about this leading to double taxation. So what happens to what is the incentive for the company? Well, the incentive for the company is, well, I used to export to this market. All my income was taxed in my home jurisdiction. I didn't have to worry about double taxation. Now, I have this new double taxation risk, and I have this double taxation risk in essentially every country I export to. Well, the incentive then is, well, maybe I should stop serving this market via export and start serving this market locally. Because if I'm serving the market locally, I don't have to worry about this double taxation, right? Well, what's that sound like? For the trade people, that sounds like import substitution. And so very quickly, from a commercial standpoint, from a practical standpoint, what the OECD negotiations are doing is moving away from the current rules that say if you're an exporter, you are free to export into that market and not be part of the income tax net. To if you're an exporter and you're exporting into the country and you're profitable, then we're going to capture you into our income tax net. And the incentive is going to be for you to avoid the double taxation, avoid administrative burdens of trying to figure out this new tax system in all these markets, to potentially start serving that market locally. And therefore, you're now into the same kind of classical trade policy issues we wrestle with any other import substitution measure. And so, hopefully that starts to connect the dots between the tax and trade aspects of this, because as you can see, we're relatively rapidly moving towards a negotiation that could create very strong incentives for companies to change their supply chains and the way they do business in these foreign markets. So I'll stop there and throw it back to